All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at civic education.
Okay.
And, maybe you're thinking, like Pledge of Allegiance, school, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it actually takes a much broader view of this.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's all the processes, really, that affect our beliefs, our commitments, what we're able to do, and the actions we take as members of a community.
Mm.
And that even includes people who are going to be members of the community, not just current members.
Right.
So it's really about forming a civic-minded person, broadly speaking.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about that, from a philosophical perspective at least, is that it suggests that it's not always intentional, right? Like just the norms and the values, even the unspoken assumptions of a community
Right.
can act as civic education, even if we don't realize it. And crucially, they point out that this isn't always a good thing. Like, you can perpetuate inequality, you can instill beliefs that are actually quite limiting just as easily as you can foster engagement and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it goes beyond the formal curriculum, right? I mean,
Mhm.
think about Tocqueville's famous line about town meetings.
Yeah.
He said, town meetings are to liberty what primary schools are to science.
Yeah.
So that direct engagement and you getting involved in your local political scene, that's a powerful way of learning about self-governance.
Yeah, if you connect that to kind of what gets studied,
Mhm.
it is interesting that we have this, big idea of paideia, this lifelong cultural project of making virtuous citizens.
Right.
But a lot of the scholarship tends to focus on these very deliberate programs in schools and universities.
Yeah.
I think that's probably because, well, those are the obvious levers, right? To
Yeah.
try to shape, especially younger people.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so for you, the listener, we know you're the kind of person who thinks about these things, these deep questions. Questions about community, responsibility, what's a good life. Even our mission today is to explore this whole idea of civic education, this complex thing, and how those deep philosophical questions really connect with the very practical stuff about shaping citizens.
Yeah.
We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on civic education as our source today.
Great.
So, let's start with this basic question. How have different thinkers through history thought about the ideal citizen? What does that even mean?
Yeah, that is the big one. And the encyclopedia points out this kind of recurring, I guess, worry that young adults are just less attached to civic life than older generations.
Right.
But I think it's interesting. They don't just lament this. They frame it more like it's a developmental process.
Right.
Like becoming civic-minded, actually caring about the common good. It's not just this thing you're born with. It's got to be cultivated.
Right.
It's got to be learned.
Yeah, totally. And this makes me think about ancient Greece, right away. This idea of paideia. Can you talk a little bit about what that was all about?
Yeah, paideia was so much more than school. It was a whole life project, really, of shaping people into these exemplary members of the polis, the city-state.
Right.
And it wasn't just about knowledge, it was about developing someone who was well-rounded, who could really help the whole community flourish. They did arts, philosophy, rhetoric, all that intellectual stuff.
Right.
But then also physical training, sports, and warfare,
Right.
deep understanding of the city's religious traditions and customs, political customs, and
Yeah.
then maybe most importantly, developing moral character through virtues.
So it wasn't just being good at a bunch of different things,
Yeah.
right? It was tied into your role in the community.
Exactly. And it's all connected to this concept of arete, which people often translate as excellence or virtue.
Right.
But it wasn't just about personal achievement. It also included your reputation, your inherent goodness in all parts of life, especially as a participant in the polis, really being an active member.
Yeah.
So becoming a better person, developing yourself, that was the same as being a good citizen. They were inseparable.
Yeah.
They saw politics itself as a school, this important school for shaping how people's lives went.
Right.
And this was kind of the common view. Plato says this in his Laws, actually, that good education is going to lead to good men.
Yes.
Good men are what make a just society,
Right.
So it's this very integrated view, personal fulfillment, being a good person, civic responsibility, all tied together,
Yeah.
which is very different from some of the stuff we're going to talk about later, which is more individualistic.
That's a really interesting contrast, with the ancient Greek ideal. Now, jumping way ahead, to classical liberalism, people like Locke and Hobbes What did they think about this whole good government, good citizenship thing?
Yeah, well, here we see a pretty big change from the ancient Greeks, you know?
Right.
These classical liberals, they were very skeptical of this idea of like a super controlled system of civic education run by the state.
Right.
You know, they were all about individual freedom, right? That was
Mhm.
their big thing.
Right.
And they'd seen how states had tried to do moral instruction in the past, and they were just like, no, we're not doing that again.
Right.
You know, any kind of big program to make people virtuous, it could so easily become a tool to oppress people, you know?
Yeah.
It could take away individual liberties and force everyone to follow just one idea of what a good citizen is supposed to be.
So they're saying, like, instead of trying to make everyone virtuous, we should make a system that protects everyone's freedom.
Exactly. Like, think about Hobbes. He was all about getting the machinery of government right, like building the system so society wouldn't just fall apart
Right.
instead of trying to, like, make people better inside, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
His view was that, you know, if you have a strong ruler, like a sovereign that's structured right, it can keep things in order no matter how good or bad the people actually are.
Right.
And then you even have Mandeville, who wrote this satirical thing called Fable of the Bees. And he was saying, you know, the public can actually benefit from people's vices, like people being kind of selfish,
Mm.
as long as the whole system is well run.
Right.
So this is a huge change, right?
Yeah.
Instead of good people being the basis for a good society, they're saying it's the structure of government that's most important.
That is a big change. But did any of these classical liberals think that civic education was important at all?
Yeah, some of them did. They were definitely all about individual liberty and limited government, you know,
No.
but a lot of them saw that civic education still had some place, even if it was smaller. Like Locke in his Some Thoughts Concerning Education, he talks about how important it is to teach kids. Well, he was thinking of boys, to teach them about virtue and reason, but, you know, that wasn't his main focus in his more political writings.
Yeah.
And then you have Madison, who, you know, he hoped that people would be virtuous, of course, but he really thought that constitutional stuff like checks and balances, that was going to be the main way to stop tyranny.
Right.
I mean, he said that republics are designed for people with, like, moderate virtue, not for perfect people, you know?
Right.
That's no one's perfect.
So instead of relying on people being good,
Hmm.
they focused on rules and institutions to kind of control those shortcomings.
Yeah, exactly. They called them auxiliary precautions. So things like separation of powers, federalism, all that, those were meant to, like, stop factions and make sure no one abused their power.
Right.
Because, you know, they knew people aren't perfect.
Right.
Even voting, which, you know, we see as this great way to hold people accountable, they were like, yeah, that's not enough. You need these other institutional safeguards.
Okay, so we go from this super integrated ideal of ancient Greece
Mm-hmm.
to this, like, skeptical rules-based system with the classical liberals.
Yeah.
And then you have Rousseau, who's like this bridge to the more modern progressive ideas about education.
Right.
Where does he fit in all of this?
Yeah, Rousseau is fascinating. It's a tricky one, you know. He was super into democracy,
Right.
but he was also struggling with this question: can you really have both a good man and a good citizen at the same time?
Right.
And for him, a good man meant someone who was, like, natural, free, equal, and guided by empathy, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And a good citizen is shaped by society, which, you know, can corrupt people.
Right. Right.
So his ideal was to find a way for people to be moral, but keep that natural goodness too.
Right.
And he thought that was possible through this idea of self-rule based on the general will. So, like, doing what's best for the whole community, even if it's not what you personally want all the time.
And his big book on education,
Mhm.
Emile, that was really about this, right? Like how to do that.
Totally. Emile is like this thought experiment where he imagines the perfect education for a boy raised outside of society.
Right.
So he's not corrupted by it.
Right.
And he's guided by nature and reason.
Right.
The goal is to educate him to be in society, but not completely of it.
Right.
So he can keep some independence and moral clarity.
Yeah.
But even Rousseau, I think, had his doubts about whether you could really protect someone completely from the bad parts of society.
Right.
I mean, he said that if you had to choose, you might have to pick between making a man or making a citizen. Like, they might not be compatible.
That's pretty pessimistic. But did he have any answers, like how to solve this problem?
Well, he did hint at some answers.
Okay.
He thought that maybe if you raise someone according to nature, that person might end up with a stronger, more genuine civic virtue, like a deeper one.
Right.
So by letting Emil's goodness, develop naturally, he might become a really good citizen because of that.
Right.
But even Rousseau said Emile might have some limits,
Okay.
maybe not enough imagination or not enough curiosity about the world
Right.
because he was sheltered from it.
So it's tricky. There are trade-offs.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about John Stuart Mill now.
Okay.
Another important guy who thought a lot about the individual and society. What was his take on civic education?
Well, Mill really believed that participating in government, like in a democracy,
Right.
it wasn't just about good governing. It was also a really important way to learn and grow as a person.
Hmm.
He said being involved in politics makes you smarter, helps you make better decisions, and it gives you knowledge about, public affairs, all that.
Right.
He thought this mental education, that's what he called it, was the training you needed to be a good citizen.
Right.
It helps you stop thinking just about yourself and start thinking about what's good for everyone.
So democracy wasn't just a system for him. It was like an ongoing school for everyone.
Exactly. In his book, Considerations on Representative Government, he talks about this idea of social progress. And he says it's about keeping the good things we have and also making things better.
Right.
And he thought there were certain individual qualities that were super important for this progress.
Okay.
Things like, hard work, integrity, justice, being careful, those kinds of things.
Right.
And then other things that are more about moving society forward,
Okay.
like being intellectually curious, taking initiative, and being courageous.
Right.
And for Mill, a good government and good citizens, they depend on each other,
Right.
like a two-way street. He really thought that being active in government at whatever level actually helps make people more virtuous and intelligent.
So he was really into that active engagement, like voting, juries, local office, all that.
Totally. He thought those were key for getting people to think outside of just their own little world and start considering what everyone needs. But, and this is important, he was also worried about people being ignorant,
Yeah.
and the possibility of what he called the tyranny of the majority,
Right.
which is basically when the majority makes bad decisions because they don't know enough.
Right. Right.
So this led him to some pretty controversial ideas.
Okay.
He thought maybe people who were more educated should get more votes.
So not everyone gets one vote.
Yeah, he called it plural voting because he was worried that, if everyone votes but not everyone is educated, then the less informed people might make bad decisions for everyone.
Right.
But later on in his autobiography, he said that if everyone had a really good education, then you wouldn't need plural voting anymore.
Okay.
So he did believe in the power of education for everyone.
It sounds like Mill thought participation was super important, but education was the key to making sure people participate responsibly.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little and talk about how civic education got started in the U.S. What were the big ideas back then?
Well, the Founding Fathers, they knew that republics could fail if people weren't virtuous. They'd seen it happen before.
Right.
So even though they made a system with checks and balances to deal with, human nature not being perfect,
Right.
they were really big on civic education, too.
Right.
Alexander Hamilton, he talked about how we needed a new type of citizen in America.
Okay.
Someone who was okay with not being directly involved in government all the time,
Right.
And he saw voting and elections as the main way people would connect with their leaders.
Right.
And schools were the obvious place to make these new citizens.
Okay, so what did that look like? I mean, it wasn't like the big standardized system we have now, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Back then, education was mostly local,
Right.
and a lot of it was private. There
Yeah.
wasn't really public funding for schools across the country. And, not everyone could even go to school. It was mostly for white boys whose families could afford it.
Right.
But one of the big names back then was Noah Webster. He was a huge supporter of using education to create a strong American identity,
Right.
separate from England.
Yeah.
He thought that having a common language and knowing American history and values, that was super important for uniting the country.
Right.
He even made his own dictionary and speller to make American English, its own thing.
Yeah. But even among the Founding Fathers, there were different ideas about what civic education should be about, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, what about Thomas Jefferson? He had a different focus, didn't he?
Yeah, Jefferson saw education as the main way to protect individual liberty from the government.
Mm-hmm.
He was all about the liberal arts,
Right.
He thought that a broad education that taught you to think critically That was what you needed to resist tyranny and demagogues.
Right.
And that would help people govern themselves effectively.
Yep.
He even had this plan for ward schools that would be free for everyone, like elementary school.
Okay.
And then the state would pay for higher education for anyone who's really smart, no matter their background.
Right.
So his focus was on making informed, independent citizens who could, think for themselves.
So for Jefferson, it was about empowering people through knowledge to protect themselves from tyranny.
Yeah.
Whereas Webster was more about using education to create, national unity.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And then you have Horace Mann and the whole common school movement.
Yeah.
What was their thinking?
Yeah, Mann's vision was to have public schools, common schools that would teach all kids together, no matter their class or religion.
Right.
And the main idea was to create a more unified society, make sure every citizen had the basic knowledge and values they needed to be part of a democracy and do well in America.
Right, right.
But the actual civic education in those schools, it was pretty basic, you know? A lot of it was just memorizing facts about how the government works and being loyal to American ideals, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that sounds more like patriotism and critical thinking. And it caused some problems too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. A lot of the common schools had this Protestant vibe,
Right.
which Catholic communities didn't like because they felt like their beliefs weren't being respected.
Right.
And that actually led to the creation of Catholic schools.
Hmm.
And then later on in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people started separating students based on how smart they thought they were and what their future in society was going to be.
Right.
So some people were like, working class kids and immigrants, they should do vocational training, learn a trade.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need all that fancy liberal arts stuff.
So they weren't getting equal opportunities anymore.
Yeah, it started to create these different tracks for different kids, which wasn't good.
Right.
But then you have John Dewey, who we talked about a bit before, and he had a totally different idea.
Yeah, what was his view?
He really believed that democracy wasn't just about the government. It was a way of life. All about people working together, figuring things out together, and constantly communicating. So he thought that all kids, no matter who they were, deserved a democratic education that would help them be part of this way of life.
Right.
He didn't like the old authoritarian way of teaching. He wanted kids to learn based on their own interests and experiences.
Right.
And he thought the school itself should be like a little community.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about that later.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different ideas about what makes a good citizen, from ancient Greece to the Founding Fathers.
Yep.
And the encyclopedia then goes on to talk about the good Democrat. What's the difference there?
Well, they're saying that every kind of government has some form of civic education, right?
Right.
But it's especially important in democracies because in a democracy, people have to both rule and be ruled.
Right.
It's like what Aristotle called the polita, this idea of constitutional government.
Right.
But, things are really different now compared to ancient Greece.
Right.
We have these huge, complex democracies with tons of specialization and this whole system of individual rights and freedoms.
Yeah.
It's not like the small city-states anymore.
So the average person in a democracy today, they're not as directly involved in governing as they were back then.
Right. There's this idea from Walter Lippmann about the eclipse of the public. He said that in modern societies, regular people are basically just watching,
Right.
Experts and the elites, they're the ones making all the decisions.
Right.
But then people like John Dewey and Jane Addams, they push back against that. They wanted to find ways to give regular people more power to make sure their voices were heard.
Right.
So this leads to a big question. Who's really responsible for making sure future citizens are good Democrats? Is it the state, the parents, or, maybe people themselves?
Right. And this is where Amy Gutman comes in, right?
Yeah, the encyclopedia talks about her work a lot.
Okay.
She's got some important things to say about this.
So what did she say about, who gets to decide about education in a democracy?
So Gutman argues that the whole society has a stake in how kids are educated.
Yeah, okay.
Everyone's invested in it.
Right.
Because, if a democracy is going to survive, its citizens need to be able to think clearly and participate.
Right.
So she says that no one group should have all the power to decide about education. Not just the parents, not just the state, and not just the experts.
Right, right.
So, She rejects these models where one group has all the authority,
Yep.
like the family state, where parents get to decide everything, or the state of families, where the state just does what parents want,
Right.
or even the state of individuals, where it's all up to the professionals.
Okay, so what's her solution?
Well, she proposes what she calls a democratic state of education, where parents, citizens, and educators all share the authority.
Right.
And this is all based on this idea of conscious social reproduction, which means that we all have a responsibility to, like, shape the kind of citizens we want to have in the future.
Right, right.
We're all in this together.
So it's a team effort.
Yeah, exactly. And Gutman says to do this right, we got to teach all kids to really think critically about different ideas of, like, what's a good life? What's a good society? They shouldn't just accept whatever they're told.
So it's not about indoctrination. It's about giving them the tools to decide for themselves.
Exactly. But she also says there are limits on this shared authority.
Okay, what are those?
Two big ones. One is non-repression, which basically means you can't stop people from thinking for themselves, like
Right.
open debate is essential.
Right.
And the other one is non-discrimination, which means that every kid who can learn has the right to an education that teaches them how to think critically.
Yeah. Everyone gets that opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And Gutman's whole point is that the skills that help people make good choices for themselves, like being able to think clearly, evaluate evidence, understand different points of view,
Right.
those are the same skills you need to make good decisions about society, too.
It makes sense. But not everyone agrees that critical thinking should be the main goal of civic education.
Right.
Right? The encyclopedia mentions Golston, who has a different take.
Yeah, William Galston has a different perspective. He says, look, in a representative democracy, the most important thing is that people can choose good leaders.
Right.
And to do that, you don't need everyone to be having these deep philosophical debates, different ways of life,
Right.
He says civic tolerance, which is super important in a diverse society, doesn't mean everyone has to question their own beliefs.
Right.
So there's this tension, between parents wanting to raise their kids with certain values
Right.
and society needing to prepare those kids to participate in a democracy where everyone thinks differently.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Okay, the encyclopedia also brings up this idea of social capital.
Yeah.
How does that fit in with all this talk about good Democrats?
Yeah, social capital is this concept from James Coleman and Robert Putnam, and it basically means the networks of relationships that people have in a society,
Right.
the connections between people,
Okay.
and it helps society work better.
Right.
Things like trust, reciprocity, feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, that's all social capital. And Putnam argued that it's super important for democracies to function well,
Right.
but he was worried that it was declining. He connected social capital directly to civic virtue, like being a good citizen.
Yeah.
He thought people are more likely to care about the common good when they're part of strong, interconnected networks.
So it's not just about individual character, it's about the relationships between people.
Exactly. And then you have Robert Sampson, who talks about collective efficacy, which means being able to organize as a community and do something about problems together.
Right.
And strong social networks are essential for that.
So if these connections are so important for a democracy to be healthy, then civic education should teach people how to build and use those networks for the public good.
Right. Yeah, I think so. It could be about, like, teaching communication skills, collaboration, how to resolve conflicts, all that.
And this idea of building social capital through civic education, it kind of connects with Elinor Ostrom's work, right? Especially her stuff on collective action problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Ostrom, she won the Nobel Prize in economics, and she was all about studying how people and communities can solve those problems where everyone needs to work together.
Right.
Like managing resources, stuff like that.
Right.
And she thought that the ability to form groups and work together, like in these voluntary associations, she called it the art and science of association. And she said that's a fundamental skill for being a good citizen in a democracy.
Right.
And you got to learn it through actually doing it. She was a big fan of polycentric governance, which means having lots of different groups all overlapping, working on problems at different levels.
Right.
And she thought civic education was super important for making that kind of system work.
So learning to collaborate and solve problems together in different situations, that's a key part of civic education if you want to have a good democracy.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, the encyclopedia then talks about deliberative democracy. How does that perspective shape our thinking about what good citizens need to learn?
Well, the idea of deliberative democracy is that, like, the best decisions come from discussions where everyone can participate, and it's all very, inclusive, free, fair, and reasoned.
Right.
So for civic education, it means that people need to learn more than just facts about the government.
Right.
They got to know how to actually participate in these discussions.
Right.
So things like being able to explain your own views, listening to others, making arguments, being open to changing your mind when you hear something convincing.
So it's not just having opinions, it's being able to talk about them thoughtfully and try to understand other people.
Exactly.
Okay, the last thing they discuss under the good Democrat is this idea of public work. What's that all about?
Well, Harriet Boyd argues that work, like any kind of work, paid or unpaid, that helps the community.
Right.
That's a central part of being a citizen.
Okay.
It's not just about voting or joining a political party. It's about, like, actively making your community better.
Right.
Building things, maintaining things, all that stuff.
Okay.
So this means that civic education should include, like, hands-on stuff, vocational stuff, where young people can learn skills and feel like